All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're getting into something, well, pretty fundamental.
Oh, yeah.
The kind of stuff that keeps political philosophers up at night.
Right.
We're talking about the relationship between religion and political theory.
Hmm.
Specifically, how do we justify the power of the state, especially when it comes to coercion,
Yep.
in a society where people have such drastically different beliefs?
And particularly religious beliefs.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Religious beliefs often come with really strong moral convictions.
Absolutely.
So how do you square that with the need for a government that everyone can, at least in theory, consent to?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? It's,
Yeah.
I think for anyone who's ever tried to really grapple with of how do we justify the use of force in a society that's diverse. This deep dive, I think, should be really interesting.
Absolutely. And to even begin to unpack this, I think we have to go all the way back to, one of the classics,
Yeah.
Leo Strauss,
Oh,
and his concept of the theologico-political problem,
right. That's a good place to start.
which basically asks, where does legitimate political authority actually come from?
Right. The classic dichotomy.
Is it revelation,
The way of Jerusalem.
or is it reason?
The way of Athens.
And, it sounds simple, but it really gets at the heart of so much in political philosophy.
It does. It kind of sets the stage for the whole debate, doesn't it?
And the thing is, you fast forward to today, to the world of, liberal democracies, and it gets even thornier.
Oh, yeah. Way more complicated.
I mean, you've got the move from divine right to, the idea that governments need the consent of the governed.
Right. The people have to say yes.
And then you've got the Reformation. Boom.
Yeah.
Suddenly you've got all this religious diversity.
An explosion of different beliefs and denominations.
And at the same time, you've got this trend of, increasing secularization.
Where religion is less central to public life.
Yeah. So it really throws a wrench into that whole, Jerusalem versus Athens thing.
It really does. How do you even approach the problem in that context?
Right. And that leads us to what we're really wrestling with in today's deep dive, which is, okay, given all that,
That complexity.
what role, if any, can religious reasons actually play in justifying the state's power?
Right.
Especially when it comes to coercion.
Especially the coercive stuff, the stuff people don't like,
Yeah.
but the state has to do, right?
Yeah. Like, can you pass a law that restricts everyone's freedom
Right.
just because your religion says it's the right thing to do,
And can that be the only reason?
even if there's no secular rationale?
Deep stuff.
Yeah.
It really cuts to the core of what does it mean for a government to be legitimate?
Absolutely. And to really grapple with this, I think it's helpful to look at a few kind of main camps or schools of thought.
Earmarks, yeah. Ways of looking at it.
And, think of this as like a three-way debate.
Okay, I like that.
You've got what we're calling the standard view.
The standard view.
You've got its critics,
The liberal critics.
who, are also liberals. They're not, like anarchists.
Right. Still operating within our liberal framework.
And then you've got this really interesting group called the New Traditionalists.
The new traditionalists.
And they come at it from a completely different angle.
Oh, yeah. They're questioning the whole project of liberal democracy.
Exactly.
Ah.
So to get started, let's dive into that first perspective.
Okay, the standard view.
The standard view. What's the basic argument here?
So the standard view, and, a lot of political philosophers today kind of fall into this camp. They basically say that in a liberal democracy, religious reasons by themselves just aren't enough to justify laws that force people to do things.
Okay, so it's not that, faith is irrelevant.
No.
But when it comes to, using the power of the state,
A coercive power.
you need something more than just my religion says so.
Right. You need some kind of secular rationale.
So there's this, asymmetry.
Exactly.
Secular reasons, good.
Yeah.
Religious reasons, not good enough.
On their own, yeah, for justifying coercion.
And this leads to what's called the doctrine of religious restraint.
Or DRR, for short, rolls off the
The
top.
DRR. So what does that mean in practice?
Okay, so the DRR, it's not like a law,
It's written down.
Right, it's more like a moral principle.
A guideline.
Yeah, a guideline. And it basically says, look, if you're a citizen in a liberal democracy,
Mm-hmm.
you shouldn't support a law that forces people to do things.
Okay.
If your main reason for supporting it is religious,
Okay.
and you can't come up with a decent secular reason to back it up.
Got it. So to make this less abstract, let's let's think about Rick
Oh, Rick, our hypothetical friend.
from the source material.
Yeah.
He's dealing with this referendum on criminalizing homosexual relations.
Uh-huh.
How does the DRR, how should it guide his actions here?
So Rick, he's a devout guy, right? And his faith teaches that homosexual relations are wrong, like fundamentally wrong.
And he sees this as like a natural law thing.
Yeah, like written into the fabric of the universe.
Right. But he also knows, he's not naive. He knows that not everyone shares his beliefs.
Right, he knows it's a diverse society.
But he still wants to vote for the criminalization.
He feels like he has to.
And he even tries to come up with these like secular-sounding arguments.
Right, even though deep down.
Even though he doesn't really buy them himself.
Yeah. It's more about winning the argument than, like, genuine conviction.
And this is exactly what bothers the folks who hold the standard view.
Exactly. It's like, hold on a second.
It's not about the specific issue, not necessarily.
No, not really. It could be any issue.
It's about Rick trying to use the force of law.
The coercive power of the state.
To impose a view that's only compelling to people who share his religious beliefs.
Yeah. It's like he's saying, my reasons are the only ones that count.
Right, and the standard view folks are like, nope, not how this works.
Exactly. In a diverse society, you need justifications for laws that everyone can at least potentially get behind.
Okay, so to be crystal clear, what are the non-negotiables of this doctrine of religious restraint?
So first off, it's a moral thing, not a legal thing.
Got it.
It's about how you should act as a citizen.
Not about breaking the law.
Right. No one's going to jail for violating the DRR.
Right.
Second, it doesn't mean you can't have religious views or talk about them.
So you're not shutting down religious people in public debate?
No, not at all. You can bring your faith into the public square. You can vote according to your conscience.
What it restricts is using religious reasons as the only justification for forcing everyone to do something.
Exactly. It's about the justification for coercion.
Got it. Now, the third thing.
Yeah.
Does the DRR say anything about where the secular reasons have to come from?
Ugh, that's a good question. It's a bit tricky. So some people, they want those secular reasons to come from a really narrow set of ideas.
Like neutral, universally accepted principles.
Yeah, like Rawls' public reason.
We'll get to them.
We will. But many defenders of the DRR, they're a bit broader. They're okay with secular reasons that come from, like, big philosophical systems.
Comprehensive doctrines.
So, like, utilitarianism or even, secular natural law theories.
So it's not necessarily about being completely neutral or avoiding any kind of, like, worldview.
Right. For a lot of folks, it's more about making sure those reasons aren't only compelling to people who share your specific faith.
Got it. And the last thing about the DRR.
Yeah.
It's not about the policies themselves, right? It's about the reasons behind them.
Exactly. So a law could be perfectly fine, good even, but if the only reason you support it is God says so,
then you're running into DRR territory.
You're in the danger zone.
Okay, so we've got the lay of the land with the DRR.
Standard view.
What are the main arguments people give in favor of it? Why should we take this seriously?
All right. So one of the big ones, and this is a heavy hitter, is the argument from religious warfare.
Oh, wow. That's, that's a big one.
It is. And the worry is this. If we let people justify laws solely on religious grounds.
Meaning using force against everyone.
Right, coercion, based on just their religious beliefs. Well, the fear is you could end up with, as Artie put it, a clash of gods.
Yikes.
Yeah, where everyone thinks their religion gives them the right to impose their views on everyone else.
A recipe for disaster.
Right, constant conflict, societal breakdown.
Basically, the end of liberal democracy as we know it.
Pretty much. So that's one of the main motivations for the DRR.
To avoid, recreating the wars of religion.
Exactly. Keep the peace.
Makes sense. But those liberal critics we mentioned,
they
don't just sit back and let that argument slide, do they?
No, they've got some strong counter-arguments.
Like what?
Well, they say, look, first of all, in a stable democracy, a democracy where people's religious freedom is actually protected.
Okay.
The risk of some huge religious war is pretty low.
Because everyone feels safe. They can practice their religion without fear.
Right. And they point back to, like, Locke.
John Locke.
Yeah, the liberal hero.
Right.
And he was like, look, religious wars, they don't happen because of religious differences.
Oh, interesting.
They happen because of intolerance.
Ah, Because one group is trying to force their views on everyone else?
Exactly, or suppress other faiths altogether. So the liberal critics are saying maybe the real danger isn't religion and politics. It's suppressing religious freedom.
Because if people don't feel free, that's when you get real unrest.
Exactly. Like, historically, a lot of times when there's been religious persecution, it's been justified using, like, secular language.
Interesting. So not even a God told me to do it kind of thing.
Yeah. No, more like, maintaining order, keeping society unified. Think about, like, the Spanish Inquisition.
Oh, right.
They weren't like, we're burning heretics because God said so.
They had all these theological arguments, but also...
We were like, it's for the good of the state, the unity of the faith.
Right, to prevent chaos and heresy.
Yeah, that kind of thing. And then the liberal critics also point out that, not all religious people are against religious freedom.
Right. Some are actually for it and on religious grounds.
Exactly. Like, there's this guy, Mar Abba. He was a, early Christian theologian. And he argued that, free will is essential for genuine faith.
So you can't force someone to believe.
Exactly. And if you do, it's not real belief.
So even within religious traditions, you see support for this idea that, belief has to be freely chosen.
Absolutely. So the argument from religious warfare, it's not as simple as it seems.
It's complicated.
It is, and the critics of the DRR, they make some good points.
Okay, so that's one big argument for the DRR. What's another?
Another one is the argument from divisiveness.
Divisiveness, meaning, social division.
Right. The idea is that laws based solely on religious grounds.
So, again, using coercion, but only justified by religion.
Yep. That's the scenario. Well, they argue those kinds of laws can make people angry, frustrated.
Because not everyone shares those beliefs.
Right. If you're forcing people to live by rules that are based on a faith they don't hold...
It's going to cause friction.
Exactly. It can alienate people, make them feel like they don't belong.
Like their values aren't respected.
Exactly. Green, he's another philosopher in the source material, he talked about how those kinds of laws have this, religious character to them. That can be really off-putting to those who don't share that faith.
Yeah, you can see how that would undermine, a sense of shared citizenship.
Absolutely. And that's a big concern for people who support the DRR.
They want to avoid that kind of division.
Exactly. But of course...
The critics push back again.
Oh, they do. They do.
What do they say this time?
Well, for one, they point out that the DRR itself could be divisive.
Really? How so?
Well, think about it. You've got these religious believers, right? And they're being told, hey, you can't use your deepest moral convictions to justify laws.
And they might feel like their voice is being silenced.
Exactly. Like they're being told to, shut up about their faith in the public sphere.
Which could lead to resentment, maybe even a sense of persecution?
Yeah, absolutely. And then you might even have secular citizens who are uncomfortable with the DRR.
Oh, interesting. Why?
Well, because they believe in, complete freedom of conscience.
Yeah.
Meaning people should be able to vote and advocate for whatever they believe in for any reason.
So they might see the DRR as an infringement on that freedom.
Exactly. As a way of, privileging secular reasons over religious ones.
Interesting. Okay. So the DRR could actually backfire and create more division instead of less.
That's the worry, yeah.
Okay. What else do the critics say?
Well, they also argue that the DRR doesn't actually stop people from using religious rhetoric in public.
So even if you're not supposed to justify laws solely on religious grounds,
right,
people can still use religious language to, persuade others.
Yeah, and that rhetoric can still be divisive.
So the DRR might not actually reduce the level of, heated debate or strong feelings.
Exactly. It's more about the official justification than the public conversation.
Okay. And their last point.
Their last point is that, in reality, most laws have a mix of justifications.
Oh, right.
Meaning it's rare that a law is passed purely for religious reasons or purely for secular reasons.
It's usually a combination of factors.
Exactly. So the DRR, it might not address the actual complexity of how laws get made.
Because it's focused on this, idealized scenario where you've got a law with just one justification.
Right. When in reality, it's way messier.
So, again, the liberal critics are saying, look, the real world is more complicated than this neat little principle.
Absolutely. It's not as simple as just saying no religious reasons allowed.
Okay, so that's two big arguments in favor of the DRR and the liberal critiques of each.
We've covered warfare and divisiveness.
What's the third one?
All right, so the third one is the argument from respect.
Respect. Okay, I'm intrigued.
This one is, it gets at something really fundamental about how we treat each other in a democracy.
Okay, lay it on me.
So the argument goes like this. Respecting people means we shouldn't force them to do things without a good reason.
Makes sense. Coercion needs justification.
Exactly. And when we're talking about laws, the justification needs to be something everyone can understand and accept.
Okay, so laws that lack a secular rationale, meaning they're based solely on religious reason.
Right. Those laws can't really be justified to everyone in a diverse society.
Because not everyone shares those religious beliefs.
Right. So people who hold the standard view, they're like, look, if you can't justify a law to everyone who has to obey it, then you shouldn't support it. And that's where the DRR comes in.
Because it's all about making sure that laws have a justification that transcends any one particular faith.
Precisely. It's about finding common ground, reasons that everyone can share.
Sounds good in theory. But the liberal critics, I'm guessing they've got something to say about this stuff.
Oh, they do. And this is where it gets really interesting.
All right, get me with it.
So their big objection is that this whole justification to everyone thing, it could actually undermine some of our most basic liberal commitments.
Really? Like what?
Like religious freedom itself.
Wait, what? How does that work?
Okay, think about it this way. Let's say you have someone like Sayyid Qutb.
Yeah.
He was an Islamic thinker.
Mm.
And his whole theological framework led him to reject religious freedom.
So he believes that everyone should follow his religion.
Well, more like he don't think the state should allow other religions to exist.
Oh, wow. That's pretty extreme.
It is. But here's the point. If we say that laws need to be justified to everyone, including Qutb,
then a law protecting religious freedom would be illegitimate from his point of view.
Exactly. Because it goes against his deeply held beliefs.
So if we take this justified to everyone thing too literally,
Right.
we could end up in a situation where basic rights are up for grabs,
Exactly.
depending on who you ask.
And that's a big problem for the liberal critics.
Because they're, fiercely committed to those basic rights.
Absolutely. They're not willing to sacrifice them on the altar of universal justification.
So how do the standard view folks respond to that?
Well, they usually say, look, when we talk about justification, we don't mean actual agreement.
Because obviously you're never going to get everyone to agree on everything.
Right. It's more about whether a reasonable, well-informed version of that person would have grounds to accept the law.
So like a hypothetical ideal version of Qutb.
Exactly. And maybe if he had all the facts and, thought about it really hard, he might come around to supporting religious freedom.
But the liberal critics, I'm guessing they're not totally satisfied with this response.
No, they're not.
Why not?
Well, for a few reasons. First, they say even a reasonable, well-informed Qutb might still reject religious freedom.
Based on his religious belief.
Right. And to prove him wrong, you'd have to get into these deep theological debates.
Which is exactly what the DRR is trying to avoid.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Second, they point to Wolterstorff.
Another one of the critics.
Yep. And he argues that, the whole idea of inherent human rights, it might actually depend on theistic assumptions.
So, the idea that we have rights because God gave them to us.
Right. And if that's true, then a purely secular, reasonable person, they might not actually have a good reason to believe in human rights.
Which throws a wrench into the whole justification thing.
Big time. And then the last thing the critics point out is that this whole idea of a reasonable, well-informed person, it's kind of slippery.
How so?
Well, who gets to decide what counts as reasonable or well-informed?
Right. Could be different for different people.
Exactly. So this counterfactual justification thing, it's not as clear-cut as it seems.
So we're back to this fundamental problem of, how do we justify laws when people have such different starting points?
Absolutely. And the critics are saying the standard view, with its focus on secular justification, it doesn't really solve that problem.
It might even make it worse in some cases.
Yeah, that's their concern.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time on the standard view, its arguments, and the pushback against it.
It's a complex issue.
It is. Now let's turn our attention to the liberal critics themselves.
Okay. Time to hear their side of the story.
What do they actually propose? What's their alternative?
All right, so it's important to remember that these critics, people like Eberle, Quinn, Stout, Wolterstorff, they're not saying anything goes.
They're not anarchists.
Right, they're not saying any reason is good enough to justify forcing people to do things.
Okay, so they do believe in constraints on political action.
Absolutely. They're liberal.
What kind of constraints do they support?
So, first off, they're totally on board with the basic liberal principles, like
Right.
religious freedom, obviously,
Right. That's non-negotiable for them.
and the equal worth of every person,
Mm,
that everyone deserves respect, regardless of their
that's
beliefs.
kind of like the bedrock of liberalism.
It is. And Perry, he's one of the thinkers we're looking at, he puts it really well.
How so?
He talks about this fundamental moral commitment to recognizing the humanity and the inviolability of every single person.
So no matter what you believe, no matter who you are,
Right.
you have inherent dignity.
Exactly. And you deserve to be treated with respect.
Okay, so that's their first big constraint. What else?
The second thing is they believe laws should aim to promote the common good.
Okay. Make society better.
Right. And they're open to those laws being justified by religious reasons.
So it's not like they're saying no religious justifications, ever.
No, not at all. They're just saying those justifications have to be good justifications.
They have to actually serve the common good.
Exactly. And that leads to their third big point, which is about epistemic responsibility.
Epistemic. That sounds fancy. What does it mean?
It basically means like having good reasons for your beliefs.
Okay. So not just believing things randomly.
Right. It's about like carefully considering the evidence,
Mm.
listening to different viewpoints, being willing to change your mind.
Being intellectually honest in a way.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Mm.
And for the liberal critics, this is really important for political deliberation.
So they're saying, yeah, you can bring your religious beliefs to the table,
Mm-hmm.
but you have to do it in a way that's like intellectually responsible.
Precisely. You can't just say, God told me so, and leave it at that.
You have to engage with the arguments, consider different perspectives.
Exactly. And you have to be open to the possibility that you might be wrong.
Okay, so they're not saying that any religious belief can justify anything.
No, they're saying, let's have a robust debate,
Mm-hmm.
but let's not exclude religious voices from that debate.
As long as they're playing by the rules of like good argumentation.
Right. As long as they're being intellectually honest.
Got it. And this brings us to, I think, one of the most interesting parts of their critique,
Oh, yeah.
which is the idea of parity between religious and secular reasons.
Right. This is a key point for them.
What exactly does that mean?
Okay, so their point is any rule we have about what kind of reasons are allowed in politics,
Hmm.
that rule has to apply equally to religious and secular reasons.
No special treatment for secular reasons.
Right. No double standard.
And they use those hypothetical scenarios
Oh, yeah, the thought experiments.
to illustrate this.
Right. Right. Where you imagine like a religious person trying to convince a secular person of something.
Using their religious beliefs.
Exactly.
That's-
And then you imagine the reverse, a secular person trying to convince a religious person.
Using like a utilitarian argument or something.
Right. And the liberal critics are saying, look, those are both examples of people using their deeply held beliefs to justify a political position.
And there's no reason to think that one is inherently better or more legitimate than the other.
Exactly. It's about the quality of the argument, not the source of the reasons.
So while they might agree that religious reasons can be used to persuade,
Mm-hmm.
they disagree with the DRR's implication that those reasons can't also be used to justify coercion.
Right. That's where they draw the line.
Because for them, that creates an unacceptable hierarchy.
It does. It's like saying, secular reasons, you guys get to be the real basis of law. And religious reasons, you're just over there on the sidelines.
Allowed to whisper in people's ears.
Right. To try and influence things.
But not to actually be the foundation of political decisions.
And the liberal critics are saying, nope, that's not fair.
So what's their biggest problem with the doctrine of religious restraint?
Okay, so their main concern is this.
Yeah.
What happens when someone can't find a secular reason for a law that they believe is just?
And they believe it's just for religious reasons.
Right. Like they've searched and searched, but they just can't find a secular argument that satisfies them.
What are they supposed to do?
Well, the standard view, with its DRR, would say, too bad, you have to abstain.
You can't support that law.
Right. Exercise restraint.
But the liberal critics say, hold on a minute.
They're not okay with that.
Why not?
Well, because they believe that people should be able to support laws they believe are morally right.
Regardless of the source of their belief.
Right, whether it comes from their religion or from some secular philosophy.
So they're saying the DRR is asking people to, like, go against their conscience.
Yeah, potentially. Like, imagine you really believe a certain law is necessary to protect human dignity.